Jack had hit rock bottom. His apartment was an overpriced shoebox with no heating. His bank account had just enough for a week's worth of instant noodles, and his last date had left him with nothing but a text that read, "Sorry, I'm just not into you." So when the opportunity came to escort two alien twins across the galaxy to a high-profile event, Jack figured it was the break he desperately needed. The job promised an astronomical fee, with a single condition: don't ask too many questions. Zorvok, the alien merchant who hired him, was a peculiar character. His green, scaly skin glistened in the dim light of his office, and his voice was a bizarre mix of gravel and smooth jazz, like a mix between a used car salesman and a Hollywood agent. He smiled too much, like he was holding something back, something Jack couldn't quite place. "They're not just any twins," Zorvok said, leaning forward. "Zella and Zira are important. You'll be their escort to the gala, keep them out of trouble, and make sure they don't get distracted. Understand?" Jack, trying to mask his disbelief, nodded. "Sure. I can handle it." Zorvok handed Jack a shiny, wrist-sized communicator. "This will help you stay in touch with them. They'll probably play games with you. You know how these high-class twins are." He winked in a way that made Jack uncomfortable. "Just keep it cool. And for the love of the stars, don't let anyone else touch them. They're very valuable." Jack figured that was the strangest thing he'd ever heard, but money was money. He had nothing to lose, except maybe his dignity. He shook Zorvok's hand, grabbed the communicator, and headed out to meet his clients. When Jack arrived at the spaceport, he was greeted by two stunning figures, the twins. Zella and Zira were dressed in matching black, form-fitting outfits that shimmered like the night sky. They didn't look like anything he expected. Instead of the icy, sophisticated, aloof women he imagined, they were playful, laughing and tossing flirtatious glances his way as if they already knew how out of place he looked. "Hey, Earthling," Zella purred, stepping forward. "I'm Zella. And this," she pointed to her twin with a mischievous grin, "is Zira. We'll be your responsibility for the evening." Jack didn't know where to look. His eyes darted from Zella's piercing blue eyes to Zira's smirk, trying not to get too distracted. Right. So you're twins. What's the plan?" Zira raised an eyebrow, her voice a sultry whisper. "The plan, sweetie, is for you to keep up." She tilted her head, clearly amused by his awkwardness. "You're here to make sure we don't get into too much trouble, but that's not going to be easy. We have a lot of fun, and you're coming along for the ride." Jack blinked, trying to wrap his mind around what she said. "Right. Fun. So, where do we head first?" Zella laughed, tossing her hair back. "Follow us, Earthling. And try not to get too lost." She winked as they led him to a sleek spaceship, the exterior gleaming under the hangar's lights. The flight to the distant planet was uneventful, save for the twins' constant banter. Jack sat in silence, trying to ignore the way Zella and Zira kept sneaking glances at him, occasionally bursting into giggles when they caught him looking back. It was hard to focus on the stars outside when their attention was so disarming. Every time he shifted in his seat, they seemed to notice, their eyes following his every move. Jack was beginning to feel like a toy in a game he didn't understand. When they finally landed on the planet, Jack's discomfort only grew. The gala venue was enormous, a sprawling, glittering palace filled with aliens of every shape and size. There were towering figures with multiple eyes, short, round beings with tentacles, and even a few creatures who looked like they were made entirely of energy. Jack felt like a kid at a costume party, trying to fit in with beings who were all so much more alien than he'd ever imagined. He stuck out like a sore thumb. "You look a little lost, Earthling," Zira remarked, her voice lilting with amusement as she leaned close to Jack, the scent of her perfume making his head spin. Jack fumbled with his suit jacket. "Just trying to take it all in. It's a bit overwhelming." Zella gave him a once-over. "We can tell. But don't worry, sweetie. We'll make sure you don't embarrass yourself." She reached up and adjusted his collar, the touch lingering longer than necessary. Zira snickered, nudging her twin. Yeah, if anything, we'll be the ones embarrassing you. Jack's stomach dropped. He wasn't sure whether he should be relieved or terrified. He'd been hired for this job, but the twins weren't acting like people who needed a bodyguard. They seemed to be in control of everything, and everyone. As they entered the gala, Jack had no idea what he was walking into. The twins immediately made a beeline for the center of the room, where a group of diplomats and powerful merchants were mingling. Jack followed them, feeling like a shadow in their wake. You don't mind, do you, Earthling? Zira whispered as she sidled up to a very tall, very muscular alien diplomat, her hand brushing against his chest. We just need to make a little impression. Her voice dripped with double meaning. Zella wasn't far behind, charming a group of well-dressed aliens with a few casual words. Jack stood off to the side, observing the chaos around him. It was like being at a circus, except the performers were all too gorgeous, and he was the butt of every joke. Guys? Jack stammered, his eyes darting around nervously. Do you need anything from me? Zira's laugh was like music, but it was also a warning. Oh, you'll know when we need you, Earthling. For now, just enjoy the show. She looked up at him with a mischievous glint in her eye. And try not to embarrass us, all right? Jack nodded, though the tension in his chest only grew. If this was how the job started, he had no idea what the rest of the night would bring. But as he looked at Zella and Zira, grinning and laughing like they owned the galaxy, Jack had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. And the universe had a way of throwing curveballs, ones that didn't always come with a manual. Jack was already beginning to regret taking the job. The gala was beyond anything he had imagined, an intergalactic circus filled with the most bizarre and eccentric beings from every corner of the galaxy. As he followed Zella and Zira into the center of the ballroom, he couldn't help but feel like a stray dog being paraded around by its owners. The twins, effortlessly captivating, were drawing eyes from every direction. Jack, on the other hand, was invisible. That didn't last long. Zira, clearly enjoying the attention she was getting, hooked her arm around Jack's and pulled him toward a group of hulking, six-armed aliens. They were dressed in long, flowing robes that made them look like they were either royalty or members of a strange cult. Either way, Jack wasn't sure which one of the two was worse. You'll be fine, Earthling, Zira whispered into his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. Just keep your cool. But Jack wasn't exactly sure how to keep his cool. One of the multi-armed aliens grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him forward, nearly squeezing the life out of him. Ah, an Earthling! The alien boomed in a deep voice, like a rolling thundercloud. I've heard about you lot. Don't mind my companions. He gestured to the other three aliens, who gave Jack looks that could curdle milk. We're just here to see how you interact with the more refined species. Jack could feel the weight of their stares pressing in on him. Yeah? He stammered, forcing a smile. I'm just here to, escort the twins. Zella, sensing Jack's discomfort, stepped in, her voice smooth and teasing. Oh, don't mind him. He's just a little nervous. He's not used to being around such imposing company. The aliens chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Jack felt like a rabbit surrounded by wolves, but he did his best to grin and bear it. Zira, ever the instigator, leaned in close and whispered, Show them how Earthlings do it. A little dance. Go on, Earthling, show them your moves. Before Jack could protest, she pushed him toward the center of the room. He felt like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The crowd went silent, their eyes on him as he awkwardly swayed back and forth, trying to figure out whether he should shuffle his feet or twirl in some ridiculous way. All he could think was, I'm going to die of embarrassment here. But Zella wasn't going to let him off that easy. Oh, come on, she said, her voice dripping with mischief. A little more flair, Earthling. Show them what you've got. Jack tried to move his body with some semblance of rhythm, but it was no use. Every twist and turn made him look like a malfunctioning robot. The crowd around him snickered, and one of the aliens from earlier laughed so hard he nearly choked. Jack shot Zira a look, a mix of desperation and humiliation, but she only winked back at him, her eyes gleaming with wicked amusement. Just when Jack thought it couldn't get worse, Zira stepped into the circle with him, her hips swaying in a way that made Jack's brain momentarily short-circuit. She grabbed his hands, pulling him into a ridiculously intimate dance, pressing herself up against him. "Don't worry, sweetie," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "This is how we do it here. Just relax." Jack froze, his body stiff with shock. But the more he resisted, the more Zira pushed, guiding him into a wild spin and dip. The music in the background only amplified the chaos, turning this whole disaster into some sort of surreal fever dream. Zella joined in, their synchronized movements making Jack look even more out of place. As he stumbled over his feet, the aliens around him cheered and clapped. Apparently, they were thrilled by this human spectacle. "You're doing great, Earthling," Zella teased, her voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "You're practically one of us now. Just a little more flirtatious, and you'll fit right in." Jack wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out, but he had no choice but to follow along. The twins kept egging him on, their seductive glances making him lose track of his thoughts. Zira's hands slid down his chest, her fingers brushing just a bit too close to something that made Jack's heart rate spike. The entire room was watching, he could feel their stares boring into him. Zella spun Jack out, and he nearly tripped over his own feet, but Zira caught him, her hands grazing dangerously low on his back as she pulled him back into the dance. "Careful there," she murmured, her lips brushing his jaw. Jack's mind was racing. He had no idea what was happening anymore. One minute, he was just some guy trying to make a quick buck, and the next, he was the center of attention in a galaxy-wide, interspecies talent show. It was humiliating, but there was something strangely thrilling about the attention. And the way Zira's hands were on him, it was hard to ignore that either. She was practically purring in his ear now, and Jack's brain was in full meltdown mode. "I think you've got it," Zira whispered, leaning even closer, her breath hot against his skin. "You're a natural, Earthling. Who knew you had this kind of rhythm?" Jack swallowed hard, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The twins were relentless. They'd turned what was supposed to be a simple job into a game, and he was the punchline. But there was something else, too. Underneath the teasing, Jack could feel the unmistakable chemistry, a fire that was threatening to burn out of control. The twins weren't just messing with him, they were playing a game of seduction, and he was the unwilling pawn. Suddenly, Zella broke away from the dance, turning to the group of aliens who had been watching the performance with gleaming eyes. "Looks like Earthling's got some moves after all," she said, her tone full of both mockery and admiration. "He's a keeper, don't you think?" The aliens laughed again, and Jack realized he'd never been so humiliated in his entire life. But for some reason, that made it even more thrilling. Jack had officially lost track of what was happening. The gala had transformed from an embarrassing spectacle into a full-blown nightmare, and the twins were making sure to drag him deeper into the chaos. As he attempted to escape the sea of eyes, Zira's arms snaked around his waist, pulling him back into the spotlight. Her lips brushed his ear, sending another shockwave of nerves through him. She was relentless, and he was, at this point, hopelessly tangled in their game. "Having fun, Earthling?" Zira whispered, her voice dripping with seduction. "You've got a lot to learn about our kind of fun." Her hand slid lower on his back, just a little too close to places Jack wasn't sure he was ready to have touched by anyone, let alone an alien. Zella, never one to be outdone, sidled up beside him, her fingers grazing his arm. "He's so cute when he's all flustered," she said, her tone teasing, almost mocking. "We should take him to the after party. Let's see how far we can push him." Jack was on the edge of losing it. He had no idea if they were testing him, playing with him, or just having a laugh at his expense, but he was certain of one thing: they had no intention of letting him leave unscathed. His body temperature was rising, his mind was in overdrive, and every nerve ending was on alert as the twins continued to press him into one awkward situation after another. Zira, noticing Jack's rising discomfort, leaned in close, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. You're just so adorable when you squirm, she purred. But don't worry. We've got plans for you. Jack's eyes widened. Plans? His voice cracked, and he immediately regretted it. What kind of plans? Oh, you'll see. Zella grinned, her eyes narrowing. But first, we need to make sure you're really ready for the next phase. She gently nudged him toward a private corridor, away from the prying eyes of the gala attendees. Jack didn't have the chance to protest as they guided him through the crowd, their hands never leaving him. He couldn't decide if he was angry or intrigued, or both. Once they were out of sight, Zella stopped and turned to face him. You know, you've been such a good boy tonight, Earthling, she said, her voice suddenly softer. You've played along, even though we've thrown you into every impossible situation. Zira tilted her head, eyes gleaming. But we're not done yet. There's a game you haven't played. Jack blinked. A game? Zira smiled, her gaze holding him captive. You see, we don't like to be bored. And you? You're about to become the centerpiece of our entertainment. Don't worry, it'll be fun, if you know how to keep up. Her voice was smooth like velvet, but there was an underlying hint of challenge in her words. Jack's heart was racing. He wanted to resist, but something in the twins' eyes told him that resistance was futile. They were playing a game he wasn't sure he wanted to play, but one he couldn't escape. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. What kind of game? Zella's smile deepened. A little test of your endurance, sweetness. It's nothing too crazy, just a little flirting. A little tension. The idea of tension didn't sound nearly as innocent as Zella made it out to be. Before Jack could respond, Zira stepped in front of him, her face inches away from his. Her breath was warm against his lips as she spoke in a voice that sent a jolt through him. Here's the thing, Earthling, she said softly. You've been a good boy so far, playing by our rules. But now, you're going to play by our rules. And let me tell you, those rules are a lot more fun. Her lips quirked in a wicked smile, sending a dangerous thrill down Jack's spine. Zella stepped forward, her fingers tracing the edge of Jack's shirt. It's simple, really. All you need to do is keep your composure. Can you do that? Jack nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I guess so. The twins shared a look, and for a moment, Jack thought they might actually back off. But then they both lunged forward at the same time, each taking one of his arms. Zella pressed herself up against his chest, her body soft but firm, while Zira wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling his face down toward hers. Now the real fun begins, Zella whispered, her fingers grazing the back of his neck. We're going to push you to your limits, Earthling. Don't say we didn't warn you. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as the twins held him captive. Zira's lips brushed against his, just a fraction too close for comfort. His breath itched as she pulled away slightly, her eyes locked on his. You're doing so well, she murmured, as if the words themselves were some kind of reward. But Jack wasn't sure how long he could last. Every touch, every word, felt like it was sending him to the brink of madness. And yet, the more they pressed, the more he couldn't help but react. The twins were like wildfire, and he was their helpless fuel. Zella, noticing the way Jack's breath quickened, couldn't help but laugh. He's really something, she said, turning to her sister. I think we've got ourselves a keeper, don't you think? Zira grinned, her eyes darkening with amusement. Oh, absolutely. He's just perfect. The words lingered in the air, and Jack had no idea if they were just part of their game, or if there was something deeper lurking beneath their teasing. Whatever it was, he wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. But as the twins leaned in again, this time their lips brushing his with a softness that didn't feel quite like a game, Jack realized one painful truth: he was in way over his head. And there was no turning back. They'd got him now. He was no longer just the hired escort. He was the prey, and they were the hunters. Jack was reaching his breaking point. His mind raced, caught between wanting to run, wanting to stay, and somehow being unable to do either. The twins were relentless, and their game had taken on an entirely new level. Every time he thought he could catch his breath, they pushed him further into their chaotic world of flirtation, teasing, and mind games. The lines between what was real and what was a game had blurred so much that he wasn't sure if they were playing him, or if he was playing them. Zira's fingers traced a slow, deliberate path down Jack's chest, her eyes never leaving his. "You're doing better than most humans," she said, her voice low and sultry. "Most would have cracked by now." Her lips curled into a playful smile. "But you've got a little bit of fight in you." Jack opened his mouth to say something, anything, but his words failed him. The tension between them was electric, and every touch sent a wave of heat through him. He wanted to protest, to tell them to stop, but at the same time, he didn't want it to end. The weirdest part? He didn't even know if he was enjoying it or just surviving it. The twins had him on the edge of something dangerous, and he wasn't sure he could handle much more. Zella, ever the instigator, stepped closer to him, her presence almost suffocating. "You know," she said, her fingers trailing down the side of his face, "we don't play fair. And if you think this is the worst of it, you haven't seen anything yet." Jack tried to pull back, but Zira held him firmly in place, her grip gentle but unyielding. "Relax, Earthling," she whispered, pressing her body flush against his. "This is all just part of the game. And you're playing it better than I thought." Zella leaned in, brushing her lips against his ear. "I think we've made our point," she murmured, her tone both teasing and serious. "You've got the job, Earthling. But it's not going to be as simple as just being our escort. You're ours now, and you're going to have to play along. Are you up for it?" Jack, still trying to gather his thoughts, realized he didn't have much of a choice. He was in too deep now. Yeah, sure. Whatever you want," he said, his voice hoarse. He couldn't believe he was saying it, but the pressure was too much to resist. Zira smiled, as if she'd won some private victory. "Good. You're learning." She leaned in, her lips brushing his once more, but this time it was different. There was a shift, a subtle change in their interaction. What had started as a game of seduction had turned into something far more dangerous, and Jack could feel it. The twins were drawing him in, and he wasn't sure if he was going to come out the other side unscathed. The room around them seemed to fade as Zira pulled him into a kiss that felt like an invitation to something dark and thrilling. Jack's mind spun, his thoughts jumbled, but he couldn't pull away. His body betrayed him, reacting to their every move, every touch, as if it had a mind of its own. Zella, watching the whole thing unfold, smirked, clearly enjoying the power she held over him. "See?" Zella said, her voice light but with an edge of satisfaction. "It's not so bad, is it? The thrill of the game, the uncertainty, the pleasure of not knowing what comes next." Jack's chest was tight. He couldn't deny that there was something intoxicating about the way they controlled the room, the way they controlled him. They were beautiful, enigmatic, and dangerous, and he couldn't tell if he was being played or if he was somehow playing into their hands. He was sure of one thing: he had never felt more alive, or more terrified, in his entire life. "Don't stop now, Earthling," Zira whispered, her breath hot against his skin. "The night is still young, and we have so much left to explore." Jack was caught between panic and exhilaration. The twins had woven a web around him, and every attempt to escape only seemed to tighten the strands. They were like two predators, playing with their prey, but Jack was starting to realize he wasn't just a victim in this game. He had become an unwilling player, drawn into their world of power, seduction, and mystery. "Where are we going from here?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Zella tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something he couldn't quite name. "That's for us to decide," she said softly. "But don't worry. You'll have a front row seat to everything. And trust me, you'll enjoy the ride." The feeling of being completely at their mercy was almost overwhelming. But there was also something thrilling about it. Jack didn't know if it was the game, or the adrenaline, or something else entirely, but he was hooked. Every touch, every glance, Every whispered word from them sent him spiraling deeper into a world he hadn't been prepared for. "You're ours, Earthling," Zira repeated, her fingers trailing down his arm. "And we're going to make sure you remember that. You're not going anywhere until we say so." Jack's mind was racing. He had no idea what this all meant, or where it was going, but he knew one thing: the night was far from over. And he was in way too deep to back out now. "I think," Zella said, a wicked smile curling on her lips, "we've got you right where we want you." Jack couldn't help but shiver. The twins had turned his world upside down, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to find his footing. But there was one thing he was sure of: nothing would ever be the same again.